The views expressed on the Final Straw Radio do not necessarily reflect those of Asheville FM, Friends of Community Radio, any of the affiliate radio stations airing the show, and sometimes not even us ourselves.
From the studios of WSFMLP in Asheville, North Carolina,
this is The Final Straw, and I'm William Goodenough. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net. Also, if you are interested in rebroadcasting any episode or segment, you are free to do so. Just send us an email if you choose to do that. If you'd like to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw, care of Asheville FM, 864 Haywood Road, Asheville, North Carolina, 28806. The show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville, specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop.
This week I spoke with Ben Turk about the August 19th call out for solidarity with prisoners and prisoner strike. The Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, a project of the Industrial Workers of the World, or IWW, syndicalist labor union, is one body organizing the inside and outside actions. For the hour, we'll be talking about the IWW, IWOC, prison labor organizing, and what's up with August 19th. More on the IWOC can be found at incarceratedworkers.org. And more about the public call for the strike can be found at imweubuntu.com/millions-for-prisoners-human-rights. Okay, but first we have a bunch of announcements we wanted to share with you. If you have things you want to announce for the show, send us an email and we may include it. Firstly, if you follow the show on Twitter, we're shifting the show's account over to @StrawFinal. Those are both capitalized, @StrawFinal. If you're on that or other despicable forms of social media, consider checking us out for announcements about the show, about related projects, and for the occasional antisocial cat meme. So here's an update on the case of Kevin Rashid Johnson from rashidmod.com, which is his main support site. Quote, supporters have received word that Kevin Rashid Johnson was picked up by Virginia officials and removed from Clement's unit on Thursday, that's in Texas, June 23rd. He is no longer being held by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, thanks to so many people phoning Virginia Interstate Compact Supervisor Terry Glenn. We have found out that Rashid is now in Florida at a, quote, reception facility, unquote. However, we do not know where that is, if he can receive mail there, or where he will end up. We will keep you informed as we find out more, and in the meantime, we'll be asking people to phone Glenn back on Monday. Rashid is a Minister of Defense for the new African Black Panther Party, prison chapter. He's a Virginia prisoner organizer, and revolutionary communist. As a result of his organizing, he has been repeatedly transferred out of state under a setup called Interstate Compact, which is used to remove rebellious prisoners and exile them to locations where they have no friends, support, etc. For the past 4 years, Rashid has been held in Texas, where he's been beaten, threatened, and had his property confiscated, been set up on bogus infractions, and more. Nonetheless, he used his time to forge connections with other prisoners and to write a series of powerful exposés about violence, medical neglect, abuse, and murder in the Texas prison system. Transfers can be opportunities for prison officials to arrange for violence and abuse. Rashid was beaten when he was first brought to Texas and lost much of his property at the time. Outside supporters and people concerned about prisoners' rights and basic human dignity need to make sure this does not happen again, unquote. Kevin Rashid Johnson's support site suggests people call the following prison employee to support Rashid, and there's a simple script for calls available at rashidmod.com. That's rashidmod.com. This is Mr. Terry Glenn, Interstate Compact Supervisor, Virginia Department of Corrections. You can write him at P.O. Box 26963, Richmond, Virginia, 23261-6963. You can call Mr. Terry Glenn, Interstate Compact Supervisor, at 804-887-7866, or you can fax his office at 804-674-3595. Next announcement, QT-Lug. When this show is over, consider bringing your Linux or soon-to-be Linux laptop, tablet, phone, or whatever device to Firestorm for the QT-Lug. A Linux and open source software enthusiast meetup, Asheville Queer and Trans Linux Users Group, or QT-Lug, aims to provide a welcoming environment for queer, trans folks, women, and others who want to explore technology and receive support from peers. Meetings are monthly and can be contacted at qtlug@tuta.io. Today, June 25th at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, there will be a VPN clinic where attendees will be helped to set up virtual private networks, or VPNs, on their devices. Little or no experience necessary.
Today at 4 to 6 p.m. and every Sunday in Haw Creek Park at 40 Avon Road in Asheville, there will be a self-protection class taught by folks at Mountain Forge. This class is informed by combat systema and other tendencies.
Now tonight, on June 25th at 7 p.m. at the Pinhook in Durham, North Carolina, there will be a benefit concert to raise funds for J20 defendants, those swept up in the kettle on January 20th in D.C. during the protests against the inauguration of Donald J. Trump. Bands playing will include New Orleans anarcho-doom band Thou, as well as Bad Friends, Slime from North Carolina, Bitter Ink, and Tescon Pole. Next up, on Tuesday, June 27th, the other transmission in Asheville, not the Prison Project, will be hosting an informal session, Stonewall Commemoration Week, downstairs at the Pack Library in downtown Asheville from 6 to 8 p.m. Learn about Miss Major, Marsha P. Johnson, and Sylvia Rivera. Micah Johnson from TQPOC from Charlotte, that's Queer Trans People of Color from Charlotte, will teach folks about the leaders who kicked off the modern-day LGBTQ movement, trans people of color. On Wednesday, June 28th, you can attend and are invited to attend a DIY screen printing workshop, or taller de serigrafía, from 7 to 8:30 at the Kairos West Community Center. This will be a bilingual event. Behind Firestorm at 610 Haywood Road in West Asheville. Bring a blank, light-colored t-shirt to print on. On Friday, June 30th at 7:30 p.m., there will be a showing of the 30-minute fourth installment of Trouble, a new serial documentary series from Submedia. This episode has a focus on repression and movement defense, with examples around support from Fernando Barcenas in Mexico, defense of the water defenders from the No Dapple struggle, support for J20 defendants, La Fuga anti-carceral organizing across Chile, the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee from the U.S. prison strikes, and more. This will be followed by a conversation based on prompts from the filmmakers. On Saturday, July 1st, and every following Saturday, Asheville Prison Books Project will be hosting a weekly book packaging and letter writing event in the back of Downtown Books and News, 67 North Lexington Avenue in Asheville. APBP sends free books and letters to prisoners around southeastern United States. Also on July 1st in Asheville, the other transmission, the not prison one, will be hosting Folk Punk Transtravaganza, Stonewall Commemoration Week. At the members-only bar Broadway's from 7 to 10 p.m., performances by Gullible Boys, Bless Your Heart, Bryn Estelle, and Atlanta's Waylon. On July 2nd, there will be a nonviolent direct action training camp from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. hosted by Claire and Coleman in preparation for a protest on July 4th against Duke Energy's coal ash pit and the Atlantic Coast Pipeline that Duke is investing in. The action is entitled Lake Julian Action, Independence from Fossil Fuels. The action camp will take place at 406 Overlook Road Extension in Arden. There's also a request on the FedBook page for fundraising. There's a GoFundMe account attached for the direct action and legal fees that may come from it.
Join Blue Ridge ABC on the first Sunday of each month. Next one is July 2nd for an evening of solidarity with incarcerated comrades. Celebrate their birthdays by sending words of encouragement and support. From 5 to 7:30 p.m. at Firestorm Books and Coffee. More info on the group can be found at brabc.blackblogs.org.
July 4th this year falls on a Tuesday, and every Tuesday at 1:30 p.m., the Steady Collective, a harm reduction project in Asheville, does its needle exchange at Firestorm at 610 Haywood Road. Show up if you need clean needles, if you want information on Narcan, or you just want to start helping out. They'll also be at the Haywood Street Congregation, 297 Haywood Street in downtown, from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. every Wednesday. On July 4th, also, from 5:30 to 9 p.m., there will be an anti-nationalist critical mass bike ride and bike parade in Asheville, leaving from Montford Park Place between Panola and Cumberland in Montford neighborhood. The ride will be a reasonable distance at a reasonable pace to allow for more participation, and will return to the park for a cool down with vegan popsicles, or vice lollies as they may be called in the UK, plus speakers, info, and maybe music. Here's a quote from the announcement. Quote, "Gather with us on July 4th to demonstrate resistance to nationalism and the American Empire's history of genocide, slavery, and ecological devastation. Especially in the present climate of rising white nationalism, attacks on indigenous sovereignty, and disregard for impending climate disaster, we reject this holiday and its gratuitous flag-waving propaganda. Instead, we'll celebrate collective resistance by taking the streets in a critical mass bike ride through downtown. Show your opposition to war and eco-devastation in this pedal-powered parade." More on this event and other local events in Western North Carolina can be found at avlcommunityaction.com.
On Thursday, July 6th to 9th, from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. each day in Knoxville, Tennessee, there will be a workshop entitled When There Is No 911, Emergency Care. This class is hosted by Mountain Forge and will start you off in the fundamental skill of emergency care in urban, suburban, rural, wilderness, and disaster, short, long, and very long, emergency situations. More info, including the location and the requisite pre-registration, can be found at their Fedbook page by searching Mountain Forge. The Institute for Advanced Troublemaking, which is, quote, a small collective of longtime anarchist organizers seeking to create a lasting movement education hub in the northeast of the so-called U.S., end quote, is hosting an anarchist summer camp which will be held August 11th through 18th in Worcester, Massachusetts this year. Some information about the group from their website. Quote, the IAT aims to raise collective capacity to target our enemies at the systemic level with effective direct action and campaign work. As Trump's presidency spurs a swell of anarchist organizing and renewed interest in anti-state, anti-capitalist perspectives, we want to escalate by building skills in direct action, creating movement infrastructure, and community organizing for new anarchists. We also want to bring experienced organizers together to innovate strategies and tactics for our contemporary context. Rather than an activism 101, our intention is to cultivate deeper understanding and praxis of anarchist organizing among people who are already doing some of that work, end quote. The main idea is to build on the social and political potential of events like conferences and book fairs to expand what is possible in this upcoming era in which it feels increasingly vital to have a vibrant and adaptive anarchist praxis. You can see more information about this event at advancedtroublemaking.wordpress.com, which will include a 3-part presentation by some past interviewees on this show about Burn Down the American Plantation. Registration ends on July 5th and will prioritize, quote, people of marginalized identities, including POC, working class, trans or gender nonconforming, those with disabilities, LGBTQI, and women, but recognize that many of these may not be visibly apparent, end quote.
If you're in Brooklyn, New York, on July 14th, you could consider going to the Punk Rock Karaoke Benefit for Certain Days Political Prisoner Calendar. The karaoke will take place from 9:30 p.m. until 12:30 a.m. at the Pine Box Rock Shop at 12 Grattan Street in Brooklyn. Back in Asheville, Carolina Mountain Redneck Revolt will be having a public event at Carrier Park, that's 220 Amboy Road, on July 16th from 12 noon to 4 p.m. This will be a meet and greet with the local chapter of Redneck Revolt in the hopes of networking, discussion of community engagements, Redneck Revolt praxis, and more. This is a potluck that'll have veg options, and it's suggested that you bring some sides to share.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We'll call like a
If you have functioning female reproductive organs, hold on to your ovaries because I'm about to make an earth-shattering, historic, life-altering announcement. I want to have children. I got locked up at 21 and didn't have any kids. I'm now 47, and every time I open my mouth, the fascist police state likes me even less. So there's just no telling when these bozos will let me set foot on the other side of the fence. So I've just always assumed that reproductive opportunities were foreclosed. But it turns out that's not the case. A federal prisoner sued the Bureau of Prisons because reproduction is a religious right, and he won. A federal court determined that prisons must make accommodations available for prisoners like me to harvest reproductive fluids and transmit them out of the prison for purposes of artificial insemination. So I've given it some thought. Let's do this. Nothing could be more corrosive, more devastating to the Swivelization program than a horde of tiny swaniacs running naked and biting ankles and pooping in the bushes. So I'm looking for 10 or 100 or 1,000 Final Straw listeners out there who want to bear my children. Stop laughing. This is serious-ish. Anyone out there interested in giving their rebel offspring the genetic advantages of my parentage should know. I have 20/20 eyesight, even now at my age. I've got excellent teeth, only 2 pinpoint cavities in my whole life. I've got no serious medical history, no history of heart disease or cancer. I'm 5'10" and currently about 210 pounds, which is about 20 pounds above my optimum weight. I can still pass the military's minimum fitness standards for an 18-year-old. No addictions. Fun fact, I have a superhuman bladder and once timed a continuous stream urination that lasted over 4 minutes. I was an adorable kid. I have to dig up some photos and get them posted at the site so prospective mothers can get a sense of what their swaniac offspring would look like. I didn't get ugly like this until I got old enough to be incredibly charming. I said, incredibly charming. And of course it goes without saying that all of my children would have an inordinate probability of inheriting my dangerous mind and subtle sense of humor. I said, subtle sense of humor. When you really stop to think about it, except for the need to avoid inbreeding in the next generation, why would any women out there want anyone to father their children but me? So, what I propose in order to appropriately select the best candidates, applicants with functional ovaries should send essays of 500 words or less to Sean Swain at riseup.net, explaining why they should be selected to mother my children. Or send 5-minute video clips. Applicants should include all information they think I'll need in order to select them. I imagine I'll then have to cycle all of the prospective mothers onto my visiting list. This reproduction has to be done artificially, and that's terrible news for all of you because I'm really good in bed. I haven't fallen out since I was 7, and I haven't wet the bed in years. Well, months. But so long as I don't drink fluids after 8 o'clock, you really don't know what you're missing. But, as I said, this has to be done artificially. So how this will probably work, once someone is selected from the tens of thousands or even millions of applicants, I'll get her on my visitation list so we can meet in the visiting room. I'll arrive with a Ziploc baggie, and hopefully it'll still be warm. She'll probably want to bring a turkey baster and a friend with sturdy heavy boots. So, when she's laying on the bathroom floor with her pants folded on the sink and she's gripping a foot in each hand, her friend can insert the turkey baster and then stomp on the bubble. With any luck, that'll launch my reproductive fluids with enough force that they'll reach her spleen. Then, for good measure, she may want to spend about half an hour standing on her head. You know, just to be sure. Then the gestation period for little bundles of maximum havoc, mayhem, and chaos and anarchy is about 9.5 months. With enough applicants and Ziploc baggies and turkey basters, we can create a whole generation of Swivelization doom. So, if you have functional ovaries and a deep hatred for hierarchy, don't wait. Email your 500-word essay to SeanSwain at riseup.net today. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from War and Corruption from Lebanon, Ohio. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can write to Sean Swain at Sean Swain 243-205 Warren CI P.O. Box 120 5787 State Route 63 Lebanon, Ohio 45036. Updates on his situation and more writings by Sean can be found at seanswain.org.
Last year was a huge time for radical organizing around the U.S. Prisoners around the country participated in the September 9th National Prison Strike, the first of its size and scope that we've seen. This event mobilized individual prisoners and also sprang from groups like the Free Alabama Movement and its sister pushes in other carceral states, Anarchist Black Cross chapters, and the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, or IWOC, of the Industrial Workers of the World Labor Union, and also just by lots of unaffiliated prisoners. Now we have what could be called a hard law and disorder administration in the White House, talking about increasing funding and support for cops, further militarizing the border and terrorizing residents, reviving the 1980s-style war on drugs and other repressive actions. In this context, it feels necessary for those who have a different vision of the world to push back and keep pushing, as we were under Obama, under Bush, and before. Well, this August 19th, there's a call for another prisoner-led show of resistance supported by folks on the outside as well. To hear more about the Millions for Prisoners' Human Rights, we're joined by Ben Turk, an organizer with the IWOC and Lucasville Amnesty. Thanks a lot for taking the time to chat, Ben.
Thanks for having me on.
So to start out, can you tell us about what's being planned behind bars and on the other side of the walls for August 19th?
I actually can't tell you a whole lot because I don't know a whole lot, and I think it is a different strategy that's going on. With September 9th, we did a lot of push and a lot of focus on what was going to happen on the inside and a call for actions on the inside, as well as outside support actions. And with August 19th, the experiment is sort of going the other way. The focus is on a call for a march on Washington and for outside support actions across the country, and hoping, or that's what's publicly being called for, and then we'll see how prisoners respond or what actions prisoners do in connection with that. But the prisoners who are planning things like that are much more circumspect than they had been for September 9th. And I'm personally curious how that will play out and how these dynamics all go differently. Organizing prison labor always has been an experimental process, and I'm excited to see different people approaching it in different ways. And August 19th, as like the next big experiment to follow up on September 9th of last year, has promised to at least teach us something about how different focuses on things can play out.
It seems like one of the things that kind of came out of last year, besides the surprise participation, was a lot of repression of prisoners in different parts of the country. Like there's still repression coming against the prisoners in Delaware who rose up after September 9th. But is that, do you think, one of the reasons there's so much circumspection?
For sure. I think the people who are calling for August 19th are affiliated with an inside group called Jailhouse Lawyers Speak. And they've got chapters across the country, but they're far less open. And as far as like how their organizing works, where their people are, and so I think that is helping them stay out of solitary confinement, allows them to continue to organize in general population, and might yield to larger actual turnouts and participation. I think it's important to underline what you said about repression, that after September 9th, especially the prisoners who vocalized support, who put their necks out to be spokespeople like Kinetic Justice or Melvin Ray or Sadiq Abdullah Hassan, all faced pretty severe retaliation and are still experiencing retaliation. From what I've heard, none of them regret the actions that they took or the positions that they took. We need to remember that prisoners face retaliation all the time for anything. And so it's not, maybe the cautious liberal response often is, well, if prisoners do direct action, they'll end up facing retaliation. It's irresponsible to support them in taking any of these kinds of risks. But the reality is that every day in prison is a risk, and prisoners can either go to the hole for standing up and taking collective action and working together against their captors and standing up for themselves, or they can go to the hole because they lost their temper with the CEO on the wrong day. So it's always a risk. Every single day is a risk for prisoners. And so they often, at least in my experience, I have not heard of anybody who regrets the repression and retaliation that they face for taking righteous action. But at the same time, I think it's really important and a continued failing of us on the outside that we aren't more effective at fighting that retaliation and defending our comrades.
Can I go down a little bit further down that rabbit hole?
For sure.
Okay. And it's okay if you can't answer this because I'm just kind of like jumping this on you right now. Can you give any specifics about where the two Free Alabama movement prisoners that you just mentioned, Kinetic Justice and Melvin Ray, or Hassan from the Free Ohio movement, where they're at now, and like what the specifics of the repression that they're facing are?
Hassan's situation, I think, is the one I'm more familiar with. I've been working with him for years through the Lucasville amnesty efforts. He was always communicating through official prison phones. He hasn't had access to unofficial means of communication. And so every call that he made was monitored, and eventually the prison decided to crack down on him. They manufactured some completely fabricated reports against him, and then they also decided to strongly enforce rules about what he's allowed to do with the phone. And so he was put on communication restriction for 90 days, a couple of different times since September 9th. He's been in solitary confinement at Supermax at the highest security level for decades, so they can't really put him into a worse place than he's already been living for almost half of his life. And so all that they can do is put on these restrictions on him. And he responded to those restrictions with hunger strikes, and we made call-ins, and we got his lawyer involved, and we fought back, and he made it through the 90-day restrictions and now has communication access restored. We're also working with other lawyers on a lawsuit to grant him media access. It's unconstitutional to deny him and the other death sentence prisoners from the Lucasville Uprising access to the media. And so we're fighting that through the courts as well. In the case of Alabama, things are different. The Alabama prison system seems more corrupt or more easily smuggled through. The guards there sell cell phones pretty ubiquitously, and it seemed easier for people there to get access to that kind of communication to the outside world, which allowed them far greater freedom to speak and communicate and organize, and is why Alabama has been the site of these mass work stoppages and things like that. But when we came to September 9th, the DOC there cracked down and went after particularly the prisoners who spoke to the media about things or who were kind of took spokesperson roles in this. The last I heard from Kinetic Justice, he is locked in a solitary confinement wing at a prison called Limestone Correctional, which has a reputation of being a place where guards can put out hits on people. And so for a while he was afraid for his life there, probably still is. And I know he went on a long hunger strike and there were a lot of calls. I believe he is currently just kind of waiting it out, surviving in there. I've heard that he does get letters out sometimes, and there are people who are in communication with him. But his mail is much more closely monitored, and he doesn't have access to the kind of communication he used to have access to. There are other people who are affiliated with the Free Alabama movement who do still have some of that kind of access, but they're much more cautious, at least at this time. Well, there's not active rising action on the inside going on. Melvin Ray, I think, is in somewhat better circumstances than Kinetic, but I don't know that for sure. Yes, there's information on IWOC's website, incarceratedworkers.org, where you can get more information about them, or through the Free Alabama Movement website and Facebook. But yeah, continuous pressure on the Alabama Department of Corrections, and I think what we really need, and it's a shortcoming of us as outside organizers, we need to respond to these situations with strong, robust, ongoing pressure and everybody in the country needs to know Kinetic's name and needs to know the circumstances that he's in. And we're not there. And that's one of the things that I think we need to be building and organizing on. The people who put their neck out and take risks to fight against the prison system that is ultimately used to oppress all of us need to be defended better than we have been defending them. And we need to build our capacity to do that.
Totally agree over here. So can you tell listeners about IWOC, or the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee? How did it come about, and what is its strategy?
Yeah. So the IWW is the Industrial Workers of the World. It's one big union for all working class people. And in recent years, IWOC is a committee of the IWW where we're trying to help prisoners organize, build collective action on the inside. It was inspired by the Free Alabama movement, who engaged in some powerful work stoppages and kind of surprise work stoppages back in 2014. And so people in the IWW who had done time themselves started corresponding with folks on the inside, and then, talked to the rest of the union and organized this committee and started building. And it has grown greatly since, especially with September 9th, which was organized by prisoners of various different tendencies and supported by people on the outside of various different tendencies. But IWOC became like a clear national organization that has some amount of structure and is able to try to deal with the logistical challenges and is closer to being able to build local branches all across the country that can respond directly to anything that might be happening inside prisons in each of those locations. So that's why I've been excited about and working with that organization. And I think a lot of other people have signed up and gotten inspired and involved and are excited to be building towards that capacity, so that whatever happens on the inside in any place, there are people on the outside who are ready to show up in real and substantive direct ways to defend and also try to control the narrative that comes afterward.
Can you talk a little bit about what groups are involved in organizing the events of August 19th?
It's, again, a coalition of different groups. The Jailhouse Lawyers Speak and Free Alabama movement are definitely involved on the inside. On the outside, George Jackson University, IMWE, IWOC are all involved and are trying to build both for a large march in Washington as well as actions across the country and in different places.
So you mentioned George Jackson in terms of the George Jackson University project, but can you talk about the significance of the date of August 19th and what is Black August?
Yeah, so Black August is a month of protests that occurs every year. It's something that the prisoners have been organizing since the 70s, when George Jackson and his brother Jonathan Jackson were killed by prison authorities for standing up and fighting back against, the system of white supremacist violence and terror. There have been a number of other events that have also occurred in August, some coincidentally, like the attack on Move in Philadelphia happened in August. A lot of other historical events dating back to before George and Jonathan Jackson also occurred in August. And so people have looked at that history and called for the month of August to be both a time for training and preparing and learning your history and building towards that, as well as a time for resistance. There's generally a call for boycotts of the commissary at the least, as well as for direct actions and things like that. And so August 19th being in the middle of that month is, I think, a way to build on and make that ongoing thing that's been going on the inside, is well known inside prisons, something that people on the outside also know about and can participate in. Again, it's a different experiment or strategy than was employed for September 9th. Leading up to September 9th, prisoners and outside supporters talked a lot about different dates of when to call for the thing, and people chose September 9th because the anniversary of Attica resonates with all prisoners, and Black August more specifically resonates with African American and Black prisoners. And so I think that's another way that August 19th changes or attempts a different strategy than September 9th, and we'll see how that plays out as well. We're expecting probably more of the Black radical organizations in the prisons to engage in this, and less of a multiracial coalition sort of thing that we saw with September 9th. But I'm sure people welcome participation from anybody, and I hope that it continues to have that coalitional and unifying character that we've seen on September 9th and prisoner revolts and rebellions prior to that in recent years.
Can you talk about why organizers would think it was important to focus on the struggles of Black prisoners specifically? And can you talk about, in general, why it's important that things like this are led by prisoners?
Yeah, well, prison is a continuation of slavery. And that, I think, the other big thing about August 19th is the focus on the 13th Amendment and the exception clause to the 13th Amendment. What you're taught in school is that the 13th Amendment came after the Civil War and ended slavery. But in reality, it didn't, because it contains this exception where if you are convicted of a crime, then you are allowed to be enslaved. And that led to first the convict lease system, and then when that was deemed, racist and terrible and atrocious, it was then replaced or evolved into the mass incarceration system that we're living with today. So we're still struggling against the same anti-Black racism and situation that has been the character of this continent since white people arrived here with slaves back in the 1600s. So it's very important that we carry that analysis forward, and that the people who are experiencing that and hold that analysis and that understanding of where their struggle is situated historically, that is what we represent and what we continue to fight for and fight against, and understand that anti-Black racism in America is a unique and particular form of bigotry and systemic violence that continues and has evolved historically in these ways and needs to be continuously confronted in a way that other forms of racism or prejudice and bigotry don't. And so it's a unique thing that I think it's important to uphold the people who are engaged with that. You want me to talk about like the nonprofit industrial complex, or the people who pretend to represent prisoners or prison reform but aren't coming from a defending prisoner perspective?
Sure, if you want to, yeah.
Yeah. There are organizations or people or politicians who like to talk a lot about mass incarceration and like to talk about prison reform and fixing these problems, but they bring solutions that come from their desire to have an orderly society, their desire to maintain a kinder, gentler form of white supremacy, and still a desire to maintain a set of social control, often also containing the priority of reducing the costs of things. There's this much famed, or before the election of Trump at least, there was this much lauded bipartisan coalition against mass incarceration that included people like Hillary Clinton and Newt Gingrich, who are actually the people who, conspired to create the giant jumps in incarceration back in the 90s. It was under the Clinton administration that we saw the biggest growth in incarceration and in laws that caused those boosts in incarceration. And that was all done in order to kind of steal the fire from Newt Gingrich's contract on America. And so now to see people from the Clinton dynasty and Newt Gingrich himself talking about how they're going to fix the problem that they caused is pretty ironic and should bring much suspicion. The idea that we can address mass incarceration, or that we ought to address mass incarceration because it's expensive to torture people in prisons, is kind of insane.
Just kind of, yeah.
That those priorities are clearly white supremacist priorities and settler priorities, and we instead want to prioritize the lives of the people who are traumatized by that system. And that system includes police and judges and courts and everything across the board, and parole and probation officers. And so these reforms, the bipartisan coalition wants to replace prison, or wants to reduce prison populations, but increase the number of people who are under supervision on probation or parole, who are under house arrest, and who are subject to reincarceration or greater surveillance or denial of their rights because they're on paper. And to me and other people who have been doing this work for a while, or who are actually experiencing that, that's not freedom. That's not improved condition. That's making people pay for their own incarceration in a different way, because you are bound to your house, or you're bound to these controls and these systems, but you have to, it turns neighborhoods into prisons. Instead of having people go to a facility that costs the state a bunch of money to run, and that, has these potential disruptions because it's such a site of trauma and violence, that obviously people who are housed in those kind of conditions are going to fight back. And instead switches that into a situation where it's neighborhoods that are the site of control. And the police then can monitor and control those neighborhoods and can sweep through. And, we've seen a lot of police murder that goes on in these neighborhoods. And so it's a different form of control, and it's not in any way a solution to the problem of mass incarceration. Instead, it spreads mass incarceration into more intimate parts of people's lives and more directly into people's communities. And so when you look to solution, you look to the people who created these problems, who built or advanced white supremacist social control back in the 90s as like a bipartisan group that's going to come together and fix the problem, you find that their solutions actually exacerbate and make things worse for the people who are affected by those. That's why it's really important that we bring in and focus on the people who are directly affected by it, make their voices central and make their priorities central to our efforts, and that we abolish prison not by tweaking the laws and working with people who want to save money because prison is expensive, but rather we abolish prison by making prison impossible, by supporting prison rebels, by supporting the people who fight back against the system from the inside out.
I mean, that's all totally fair and wonderful. But the call out that, at least, and I know you can't speak for another organization you're working alongside of, but the logic that's argued behind the call for the Millions for Prisoners March in D.C. is basically a petitioning of the government to change its ways, and also it's promoted in terms of abolishing the amendment to the exception clause to the 13th Amendment, which is a legal push. So why should people who are abolitionists participate in these solidarity events? Can they? I mean, there's room for people, I would imagine, who just want to offer solidarity with prisoners and don't want to make the legalistic arguments, right?
For sure. And I think that none of the, as I've been saying, this process is an experimental process. The ideas and the strategies that I bring to it are not certainly not the only strategies or ideas that will work or could work. And all the different things that people do, all the different approaches to abolition that people bring are ways of getting somewhere on the issues. I live in the state of Wisconsin, where we have an amendment to our state constitution, which is basically the 13th Amendment with the exception clause removed. And all that means as far as the lives of the prisoners are concerned is that the state has to do this like arbitrary restitution law, which they recently enacted, where they can take away more than 50% of the state pay, which is already pennies on the hour. And they can call that not slavery. But in fact, it is still forced labor. It is still not fairly compensated, and it's not voluntary, so it's definitely slavery. But at the same time, there are places, like there was recently a push in Colorado to amend the state constitution to abolish prison slavery and to do basically the same thing that we're calling for on a national level. And that effort failed in Colorado. Like by referendum, voters were like, no, we want to keep prison slavery around. And so on a like rhetorical or symbolic level, making that issue present is a way of making prison slavery something that we are aware of, so that no one in America can anymore say that slavery has been abolished. No one in America can say we don't live in a slave state. No, we do. We live in a white supremacist slave system here in this country. And as long as that law is still in place, and as long as these practices are still in place, it's undeniable. And I think it's interesting to see how that has shifted. I can, like 5-6 years ago, I called into a radio program on NPR talking about the 13th Amendment, and the guy hung up on me. And he was like, we're not going to talk about slave prisoners as slavery. That's absurd. We can't have that conversation. And now there's award-winning documentaries about the 13th Amendment. And that same radio show hosted prisoners talking about prison slavery. And the guy was like, my mind is blown, blah, blah, blah. And it's the same guy who hung up on me 5-6 years ago. And so we do see, I don't think that the value that the effort that it would take to amend the Constitution is worth the benefit that would come from amending the Constitution. That to me, that doesn't seem strategic. But the talking about it and taking on that fight and pushing that forward and having that conversation has, I think, a lot of value. And so I'm happy to see that being foregrounded within this effort. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe these organizers will find that does get passed and does make a difference and can improve these situations. But in the meantime, it's creating a context where people can't deny that there is slavery in the society that they live in and that they are complicit in that. And so I think foregrounding that does have value on that kind of level.
Yeah, I mean, if nothing else, like that's the kind of thing that you can have conversations with people in your community, like whether or not they've been harmed by people who are currently incarcerated, whether or not they, have been incarcerated formerly or have relatives that are incarcerated. That is so, the idea of slavery continuing is so anathema to the mainstream American perspective that, well, as is like active genocide against indigenous populations, which is still going on too. But
right.
I think without us having these conversations and however we want to address them and how start the conversations, the more we have them, the more people are going to be like, yeah, actually capitalism sucks, renting sucks, patriarchy exists, racism is the foundation of this system, and the negative impacts of that come around to people that look like me that, are privileged by the system at the same time. Maybe just to a lesser of a degree. So it's in my interest to struggle against the carceral capitalist state. Right,
yeah. And it's in your interest both in terms of like it actually being your economic interest that, capitalism does harm all of us, and the tools that are used to, to incarcerate black men and force them to work are used against white people as well, and are just ubiquitous tools of surveillance and control that affect everybody. But it also affects your humanity, just to recognize and to be like, oh, yeah, I'm okay with being complicit in a system of forced labor and white racial terror. Yeah, that's okay with me. Forcing somebody to actually say that and admit that, I think delegitimizes the people who make that decision, the people who look at this situation and say, yes, Nazism is okay. It shrinks that space where people can be like, no, I'm just like want everybody to be cool and everything to be all right, and like I'm not a racist, I'm not a white supremacist. I just think that Black Lives Matter is, attention-grabbing movement or whatever, that these people don't actually have concerns. If you confront somebody who tries to take that mealy-mouthed alt-right position and be like, no, this is about slavery, and slavery is continuing, and you are endorsing slavery, and you are seeking the continuation of slavery, and that is what is going on here. That's what you're promoting. Then they either have to be like, you're right, I'm a Nazi, or they have to change their position. And if people want to maintain their humanity and not come out on the side of white supremacist terror, then they need to change their positions. And so then you find the people who continue to support and participate in not just like the alt-right or the Trump administration, but any form of white supremacist democracy in America, including the Democratic Party, who has engaged in terror against the Black community more efficiently than any other organization, I would argue. It delegitimizes all of them to have these like cogent and direct conversations about slavery and genocide that are continuing traditions in this country today.
So how can folks who are, now that we have given listeners all sorts of reasons, if they didn't have it already, to get involved and support prisoner struggles, how can folks outside the prison walls get involved in spreading word about this event? If listeners are in prison or are in contact with prisoners, what are some good resources and methods to share this information about August 19th?
So the incarceratedworkers.org is our website. The main outside support for the Millions for Prisoners Human Rights March is IamWeUbuntu.com. That's the website where you can go and get information about going to Washington, where that organizing is happening, or setting up solidarity events and rallies in your area. Incarceratedworkers.org is IWOC's website. It's a place where you can get involved in building IWOC chapters that support prisoner resistance or direct action organizing in prisons. The way that prison is organized, it's broken down by state. Each state system is significantly different. Here in Wisconsin, the way the prisoners experience incarceration is very different than the way the prisoners in Alabama or Texas experience incarceration. The way that the laws work, the way that the correctional culture is different. I don't want to say that one is better or worse than another, but they're very different from each other, and so it makes sense that the level or the unit of organizing that we look at is statewide on this, in at least my opinion. And so getting involved with other people in your state, in your city, in your community to support prisoners in your state is, I think, the most strategic way of doing this. And so IWOC is working to build chapters all across the country, and we'll provide resources or prisoner lists, contact lists, and things like that to anybody who wants to get involved in this work of supporting mass movement of prisoners engaged in direct action on the inside. I know the freedom movement, the Free Alabama, Free Ohio, Free Mississippi movement is also interested in doing that work, and it has different sort of social networks that they operate with, and I'm excited to see coalitions between these different tendencies or approaches work. I've always been an advocate within IWOC to support coalitions and to not try to compete. If in Michigan, for example, there's the Michigan Abolition and Prisoner Support Organization, MAPS, that has done a lot of really good work around the Kinross uprising that started on September 9th. And I'm not interested in seeing an IWOC chapter try to compete with them, but rather IWOC send resources and connections and send people in Michigan to work in coalition with them. And so I think that's true in Alabama, Ohio, anywhere where there's other tendencies and people who are actually doing this work. I'm interested in building coalitions to do it. But if there's nothing like that going on where you're at, IWOC is a way to kind of get some resources and some things started up and some best practices going. So if you're interested, you can go to incarceratedworkers.org and find out more information about starting a chapter in your town.
Ben, thank you so much for chatting. You're awesome.
Thank you for having me. Yeah. I do my best.
That was our conversation with Ben Turk, an organizer with the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee of the Industrial Workers of the World, and also with Lucasville Amnesty. More on the upcoming prisoner strike can be found at imweubuntu.com, and more on the IWOC can be found at incarceratedworkers.org.
The views expressed on the Final Straw Radio do not necessarily reflect those of Asheville FM, Friends of Community Radio, any of the affiliate radio stations airing the show, and sometimes not even us ourselves. You're listening to WSFM LP 103.3 FM in Asheville, North Carolina. This is The Final Straw, and I'm William Goodenough. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net. Also, if you are interested in rebroadcasting any episode or segment, you are free to do so. Just send us an email if you choose to do that. If you'd like to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw, care of Asheville FM, 864 Haywood Road, Asheville, North Carolina, 28806. The show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville, specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop.
Right now you're hearing Southern Cross by Bad Friends off of their EP. Again, they're going to be playing tonight at the Pinhook in Durham alongside of Thou, Slime, and a bunch of other bands as a benefit for the inauguration Kettle arrestees.